Good morning, everyone. This is Flora from the events team at ASIFMA. Thank you very much for joining us today at this virtual event, Indonesia IBOR Transition. Let me introduce our host today, our CEO, Mr. Mark Austin. Mark, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Flora. Very much appreciate everyone being here today. I think we're having a little technical issue because it won't allow me to turn my video on. But I just wanted to really thank everybody for taking the opportunity today to come in and see our local market perspective Indonesian IBOR transition webinar. This is part of a series. We've done a number of these already throughout Asia, and we will be doing a few more coming up. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really wanted to thank, before we go any further, to thank our co-host, the Indonesian Foreign Exchange Market Committee, as well as our lead sponsor, Refinitiv, as well as one of our endorsers, ICMA, who will be speaking, both of which will be speaking here today. So thank you very much for that. If I go on to the next slide on simultaneous interpretation, this is available here today. This webinar will be both in English and Bahasa Indonesian, where simultaneous interpretation is provided. The instructions are up on the screen. But you can basically click your preferred language through the interpretation button. It's the little icon with the globe on the bottom of the toolbar, and select which language, whether English or Indonesian, that you prefer. If I look at the agenda, we have a really excellent agenda here for you today. We have, after my welcome remarks, we'll have welcome remarks from Chairman Darmawan Jadandi, and then we'll have a keynote address from Park Doni from the Bank of Indonesia. Then we'll have a regional update from my colleague Philippe Dirks from ASIFMA. And then followed by an impact of the LIBOR transition on the Indonesian banking industry from Sergei Volkov from PwC. Following that, we'll move into some product presentations. We'll have Jing Gu from ISDA, Mushtaq Kapezi from ICMA, Adrian Cheng from Herbert Smith Freehills, and then also Adrianus, from Arditomo, from Hiswara, Benjamin, and Tajung. And then we'll follow that with the data and infrastructure preparedness talk from Edmund Lee at Bloomberg. And then following again another panel with Branko Window from Bank Central Asia, and then Tony who from the Indonesian Financial Services Authority, and then Tiek Pyu Fu from Standard Chartered, and then Ryan Page from Refinitiv will moderate that. And then finally, we will have, under the accounting and taxation issues, David Wake from PwC, and then some closing remarks from Steve Dean at Refinitiv Indonesia. We also would like you guys to be very much involved in this. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom on the toolbar. Ask, during the various different speakers and panels, please ask questions, and then the moderator will do his best to put those to the speaker. So that's at the bottom of the toolbar. And now I just want to introduce our first welcome remarks, and this is going to be from Mr. Darmawan Jadandi, who's chairman of the Indonesian Foreign Exchange Market Committee, and these welcome remarks will be given by pre-recorded video. So over to you, Flora, for that.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining this distinguished event that conducted by ASIFMA, Asia Securities Industry and Financial Market Associations, in collaboration with Indonesia Foreign Exchange Market Committee. First of all, on behalf of Indonesia Foreign Exchange Committee, let me humbly greet Mr. Mark Austin, as CEO of ASIFMA, Mr. Doni Hutabarat, Executive Director of Financial Market Development, Bank Indonesia, all representatives from Bank Indonesia and Indonesia Financial Service Authority (OJK), all fellow speakers, industry leaders, and all our participants. I wish you all nothing but the best. Here we are at the end of year 2020. We have came through much of social and economic tense amidst COVID-19 pandemic, including some volatility in our financial market. A black swan that changed our way of life and our way of doing business. Thankfully, the spirits and eagerness to carry on the preparation of IBOR transition is still intact, and hopefully we are all on track with the deadline. As we might aware that UK Financial Conduct Authority will terminate the use of LIBOR by the end of 2021 as benchmark, and moving on to more reliable and credible benchmarks alternative such as SOFR for US dollar and SONIA for GBP. The transition will not only impact banking industry, but also impact other sectors such as corporation, insurance and investment industry. Therefore, we need to adjust and to be prepared for this transition. Together with Bank Indonesia and OJK, IFEMS will continue to support the transition process and to make sure that process will be smooth to all the industry players. As of end 2019, the total exposure to LIBOR-related contract in Indonesia is around 72.7 billion US dollar, and more than half of them will mature by 2021. The migration process will be challenging, recalling that there will be many objectives need to be done, such as operational concern to make sure systems are ready to accommodate the changes and legal risk due to contracts that mature above 2021 need to be amended to the new benchmark rate. I believe that most of banks are intensively preparing its transition framework and communicating with their clients regarding renegotiations of the contracts and activating fallback clause. Other challenges such as accounting treatment for loan and derivatives contract, valuation and risk management to identify potential risks, as well as stress testing the impact of benchmark transition are needed to address accordingly to support IBOR transition. Banks and the stakeholders must reach unanimous terms and conditions before moving on to new risk-free rate alternatives. That is why common level of understanding of what to expect and prepare need to be continuously promoted. After 2021, in Indonesia, there will be around 33.6 billion US dollar LIBOR-related contract, mostly dominated by derivatives contract. Although there may be pricing and valuation differential issues between LIBOR and the new benchmark, the bilateral talks between parties should aim to give the best solution for both. The guidance and roadmap from regulator perspective also needed for us to prepare for this transition. As we already know, Bank Indonesia has been successfully conducted interest rate reform in 2019 to strengthen the benchmark rate for IDR by introducing Indonesia as replacement of JIBOR overnight. Current benchmark Indonesia is based on as well as comply to IOSCO principle, which are protecting investors, ensuring that markets are fair, efficient, and transparent, and reducing systemic risk. Hopefully, the transition of IBOR could follow similar pattern of smooth transition, and I believe Bank Indonesia and OJK will continuously work hand on hand with financial industry to strengthen Indonesia financial market. Today's event hopefully covered key concerns of IBOR transition, and questions from audience are expected for a more fruitful discussion. There will be perspective, legal perspective of the transition from ISDA that will give insight to mitigate legal risks arise from IBOR transition. Discussion about banking industry preparation by panels of expert bankers, and last but not least, accounting. Valuation and tax challenges perspective from our expert panels as well. We also have the privilege to have our speaker from BI and OJK giving us some regulators' perspective on the transition. Without further ado, once again, thank you for joining this webinar, and I would like to wish you all to enjoy this event. Hopefully, this event could be helpful for us to navigate IBOR transition that will help us to have a more credible, transparent, and efficient financial market that eventually will boost the growth of this nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darman, for those welcoming remarks and very comprehensive overview of IBOR and the challenges around it, and also the preparation that Indonesia has already made in relation to it. Very, very highly appreciative of that. We have close to 150 people already on the webinar, so thank you very much again for joining. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Donny Hutabarat, who's Executive Director of the Financial Market Development of Bank Indonesia, to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, Park Donny. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. A very good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank you to ASIFMA as a host of this webinar, and also to my colleague in IFAMS as a main contributor to this event. Distinguished guest speaker and participant, ladies and gentlemen, to begin this webinar, let us express our gratitude to God Almighty, who has blessed us with good health and salvation, which have allowed us to gather in today's webinar on IBOR transition in Indonesia, organized by ASIFMA. As we may all know, one of the global benchmark reform agenda is LIBOR discontinuation as the global market reference by the end of 2021. Furthermore, its jurisdiction is encouraged to carry out IBOR transition and develop alternative risk-free, such as SOFR in the US and SONIA in the UK, and ESTR in Euro area, and other risk-free rates. Although the COVID-19 pandemic has affected several IBOR transition programs, there is no final decision to reaffirm that the LIBOR cessation timeline will be postponed. Therefore, consider that this webinar is greatly time appropriate to be held, considering the only 12 months remaining transition time before the LIBOR discontinuation by the end of 2021. Recently, there is increased uncertainty over the global economic outlook and increased risk of default, particularly during the crisis, put pressure on financial markets. On the other hand, studies conducted by several central banks shows that the movement of LIBOR during the market stress has highlighted inherent weaknesses of LIBOR and underscore of urgency of finding acceptable replacement. Some of the phenomena that occur during market stress include the widening of LIBOR and OIS spreads have been diluting the impact of rate cut policy implemented by central bank to support the economy. In addition, the increasing use of expert judgment in the LIBOR formation mechanism illustrates LIBOR fragility, as well as shows that the LIBOR formation mechanism as a reference rate is not functioning properly. These two phenomena show the importance of efforts to improve the existing reference rate formation mechanism and encourage market participants to develop a more objective approach to reduce dependence on LIBOR. Ladies and gentlemen, As part of the global financial market community, Bank Indonesia also has the interest in ensuring that the IBOR transition process will not cause disruption to the domestic financial market. On this occasion, allow me to share the current progress has been taken regarding the development of benchmark reform in Indonesia. Since 2015, Bank Indonesia has just continued to strengthen the credibility of benchmark interest rate on the domestic financial market, namely JIBOR, Jakarta Interbank Overnight Rate. Strengthening is done by applying transition-based mechanism submitted by contributing banks that can be executed or transacted between contributors following the time of JIBOR publication. In addition, in submitting quotation, contributing banks are obligated to comply with YOSCO principal guidelines, as Pak Darmawan already mentioned. In line with the development of implementation of benchmark reform has been taken in several countries, such as the issuance of SOFR in the US and SONIA in the UK. In 2018, Bank Indonesia has published the risk-free rate as a reference for the rupiah money market, namely Indonesia Overnight Index Average. Unlike JIBOR, which is quoted based, but Indonesia formation mechanism is based on real transaction data. Compared to other emerging markets, Indonesia is considered relatively fast in forming risk-free rates. This is mainly reported by a well-established daily money market transaction reporting system that Bank Indonesia have. The existence of Indonesia is expected to become the reference rate for OIS, overnight index swap transaction. Currently, the use of Indonesia and JIBOR goes hand in hand and complements each other. Indonesia is used for overnight tenors, while JIBOR is used for tenor 1 week, 1, 3, 6, and 12 months. Bank Indonesia continues to encourage the development of market players. We hope that Indonesia and OIS-based transaction can continue to develop and actively used by market players so that in time the OIS rate can be considered to replace JIBOR. Thus, the Indonesian financial market will have a transaction-based term rate that supports the development on interest rate-based hedging transactions. Efforts to increase awareness and readiness for the termination of LIBOR are also carried out through coordination between authorities within Bank Indonesia, OJK or FSA, and Ministry of Finance, and involve of the association and market player, namely IFEMS, Indonesia Foreign Exchange Market Committee. Through coordination between the authorities and the involvement of market players, in the transition process, it is believed that the anticipatory steps can be taken massively and measurably. In the last coordination meeting in November 2020, the Forum of Authorities agreed to form an IBOR transition working group to address potential problems, including those related to legal, accounting, tax, risk management, and education aspects. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the important stages of the global benchmark reform is mapping the readiness of all countries on the upcoming LIBOR discontinuation by the end of 2021. In this section, Bank Indonesia, represented by the Financial Market Development Department, which is also a member of the FSB OSSG, regularly holds meetings and dialogues with the market players, carries out surveys, publishes publications, and prepares adequate transitional mechanism to prevent the mitigate negative impacts on stability of the financial system. At the end of 2019, Bank Indonesia conducted a survey to determine the readiness of the banks for LIBOR discontinuation, as Pak Darmawan mentioned briefly in the earlier speech. The survey involved 39 domestic banks representing 86% of exposure to foreign currency loan, rupiah loan, and foreign currency derivative transactions. The survey shows that the total exposure to LIBOR at the end of 2019 amounted 22.7 billion US dollar, with 54% of this exposure ending in 2021. Meanwhile, the total LIBOR exposure that's still outstanding after 2021 is estimated to reach 33.6 billion US dollar, or 5.26% compared to the total national banking loan and derivatives transaction. Although the LIBOR exposure is relatively small compared to loan and derivative transaction nationally, this still need to be a concern for the banks with LIBOR exposure, given the potential risk of dispute that may arise. The survey was also aimed to see to which extent banks are prepared in anticipating LIBOR discontinuation. The survey shows that the majority of the domestic market players are already aware of this matter. As many as 25 out of 26 banks with outstanding LIBOR exposure after 2021 have plans to anticipate LIBOR discontinuation. The anticipation includes identifying alternative replacement rates, reviewing affected financial contracts and internal business process, and conducting socialization to employees and related business processes. Of these 8 banks have formed a transition team tasked with managing adjustments to the affected business processes and preparing risk mitigation plans for the bank. At the end of 2020, Bank Indonesia plans to conduct another survey with a wider range of respondents, which includes not only banks but also other market players, such as non-bank financial institutions and corporations. The expansion of survey correspondence coverage aims to obtain a more holistic and comprehensive picture of the readiness of domestic market players in anticipating the LIBOR discontinuation by the end of 2021, including the readiness of industry or other affected sectors. For this reason, we expect an active role from the banks and corporations that you represent in responding to the survey we will conduct. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to dialogue with the market players and conducting surveys building awareness and readiness of the market players regarding LIBOR discontinuation, in May 2020, Bank Indonesia has distributed CEO letter to all banks and several corporations with notable foreign currency exposure. In the letter, Bank Indonesia emphasized the need for the banks and corporations to do several things, including to identify financial contracts that use of LIBOR as a reference rate, prepare contingency plans for financial contracts that use of LIBOR by adding fallback clauses, actively limit the use of LIBOR in new financial contracts, analyze necessary measures to be taken on affected business process as part of risk mitigation, and documenting governance in the implementation of LIBOR transition. Distinguished guest speaker and participant, ladies and gentlemen, it is realized that there are many challenges and problems that lies ahead need to be anticipated in transition period towards LIBOR discontinuation. Given that the transition period is only 12 months away, we urge market players, including banks, non-bank financial institutions, and corporations to raise awareness and readiness for the LIBOR transition process. Bank Indonesia and related authorities are committed to ensuring a smooth transition from LIBOR to the perspective risk-free rate in Indonesia financial market. We realize this can only be achieved if supported by initiatives and proactive steps from the market players, both from industry association and various parties which use LIBOR as a reference rate in their contracts. As a form of implementation of this commitment, Bank Indonesia support the implementation of this webinar as part of an effort to build awareness and readiness of market players. Hopefully, this webinar can bring forward the latest information on various aspects related to the global LIBOR transition, which shall be used as a remarkable input in increasing the readiness of domestic market players in Indonesia. Finally, we hope this webinar will run effectively and lead productive and fruitful discussion going forward. On behalf of Bank Indonesia, I would like to thank to ASIFMA as a host of this event, all panelists, resource persons, and participants who attended this webinar. Thank you. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Pak Doni, for this very insightful presentation. Clearly, Indonesia seems to be very well prepared for the task ahead. So thank you again for your participation in this webinar. And as for the today, we seem to have now 161 people have joined, so it's a very good turnout. And welcome to the ones who have recently joined the webinar. So my name is Philip Dirks, and I'm as Mark Ostent was introducing me, so I'm heading the fixed income division at ASIFMA, and I will take over from now as the host of this webinar. So I would like to give you a bit of some highlights and some updates from a regional perspective, but I think it's important to give you first a bit of an insight of what ASIFMA is. So ASIFMA is an independent regional trade organization. We have about 140 members, banks, brokers, asset managers, representing about probably more than 35 trillion US dollar under management and custody. We have law and consulting firms and market infrastructure service providers. We are the voice of our members as we promote and advocate for a liquid, deep, and broad capital market, but also stable, competitive, and an efficient one. And we have built a very good relationship with the regulators, and we have seen over the years them coming to us and listening to our recommendation. But one of the role of ASIFMA is also around education. And it is a role that we have envisaged for quite a while. And the idea is really to support our members and the broader market from that point of view. So, and the IBOR webinars that we have here today are really fitting into that perspective. We are also going to roll out in the course of next year additional training sessions, more designed for starting staff in the financial industry. So what's the role of ASIFMA from an IBOR transition point of view? So there was a strong willingness from our members to see ASIFMA playing a role in the IBOR transition. And clearly, this is indeed one of the most significant transition the industry will have to go through. And I would think it's pretty similar in impact to the migration from MT to ISO 20022 in the payment space. Our colleagues from ISDA, ICMA, and APLMA are currently working very hard on the documentation contractual obligations linked to these contracts. And as you see in the program, this will be covered later today. But we found that in the region, there was clearly also for their firms. So we decided to organize webinars, and we thought we could concentrate initially on two main centers, Hong Kong and Singapore. But we quickly realized that when we organized our first webinars in collaboration with the HKMA is that people from other jurisdictions did not join, and because they really needed a stronger content. Second, yeah, and some local content. So we've embarked in rolling out 8 sessions in other jurisdictions. So far, we had Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia today. So overall, this is the 6th one in the series, and we will have Taiwan in January and Singapore in February. So we're hoping to add Philippines and China very soon. It has been very successful. So we had over 2,300, 400 participants for these webinars. So the one thing we did as well is that when we went through these webinars, so we did also an IBOR survey. So from a discussion from our members, we realized that there were a number of frictions, an issue that was still outstanding, and probably more by the day. So we decided to capture these issues through a survey. One of our law firms members, Ashurst, has consolidated the results into a paper that will serve as a base for future action and advocacy. So the key findings can be summarized in 4 main areas. The first one is the lack of standardization, harmonization, and consensus between the different jurisdictions and asset classes is as an area of common concern. The transition issues around legacy contracts. Third, the legacy and regulatory and conduct risk in connection to IBOR transition. And finally, the transition issues in connection with local benchmark. We also published over the summer an IBOR transition guide for Asia Pacific. It was published by ASIFMA, ICMA, ISDA, and APLMA with the contribution of Deloitte and Morgan Lewis. The paper lists some of the key implementation issues and provide a practical implementation checklist for financial institutions as they're moving to implement their individual transition plans. And that includes program governance, transition management program, communication strategy, risk management, transition of existing contract, accounting, tax, and reporting issues. So the transition guide is available to download on our website, but you also can scan the QR code, which is on the screen here. And finally, I will just conclude by saying that the Financial Stability Board has just published, that was on the 21st of November, so a bit less than a month ago, their latest LIBOR transition report, summarizing the work that has been done in some of the major jurisdictions around the world, and of course in Asia Pacific. And I would just like to read the conclusion, which I think it's very telling vis-a-vis the work that has been done and still needs to be done. So it reads, the transition away from LIBOR remains a significant priority. While important progress has been made over the course of 2020, this work needs to accelerate further in early 2021. Continued engagement from the private sector in conjunction with a significant commitment by the official sector is critical in order to support this transformational effort. With only 1 year left until the end of 2021, all market participants, both financial and non-financial firms across the globe, must now ensure they follow the necessary steps to avoid disruption to the performance of their contract. This will require steps to stop issuance of new product linked to LIBOR and effort to transition away from LIBOR in legacy contract whenever feasible. So that is for me. I would like to close on that note. So let's now enter into, Flora, next slide, please, to the core the webinar, and I'm very pleased to welcome Sergei Volkov, partner for PwC in Japan. Federal PwC has given us quite a very strong hand in building this webinar as well. And he will present us the impact of LIBOR transition on the Indonesian banking industry and key consideration for a smooth transition. Sergey, the floor is yours.
Philippe, thank you so much. And I'd really like to thank Mark, Philippe, Millie, and Flora, and the rest of the folks at ASIFMA for inviting me to speak to everyone today, and to the participants for making time. I guess, and I don't know if, Philippe, if we can present the slides on your end.
Flora, next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. So you just have to give Flora the cue, and she will move slide by slide. So you just tell her when to move on to the next slide.
Okay. And for some reason I cannot see the slides, so I guess I'm on slide 2.
Yeah, with the LIBOR reform effect, a wide range of product with the bubbles on the left bottom.
Very good. Well, I guess in terms of a LIBOR transition in Indonesia, I've had the distinct pleasure to work with 7 clients across Asia Pacific on LIBOR reform over the past 2 years. And what we're finding is that the themes and the things that people have to do are very much the same in tackling LIBOR transition, and the issues that come out of transition programs are very much the same. In terms of LIBOR, I think we heard from the public sector earlier today about just preponderance of LIBOR across Indonesia. I mean, I think globally we're finding LIBOR in all types of financial instruments, including derivatives, fixed income products like loans, bonds, securitizations. They're very much dominant in sales and trading, as well as corporate banking, asset management, and really span across the functions of a bank, impacting not just the front office, but middle office, back office. And of course, there's also impact on the buy side. Asset managers, insurers, and corporates have a lot of LIBOR exposure. Now, in terms of US dollar LIBOR, it's roughly a $200 trillion exposure. And if we take other IBORs, local IBORs like TIBOR and HIBOR and SIBOR and JIBOR, that's another several $100 trillion of exposure. In 2016, when the official sector did a survey on how much LIBOR is in the global markets, they found about $200 trillion of US dollar LIBOR. And if people stopped issuing new LIBOR at that time, we would only have about 35 trillion left. So call it roughly, I guess the bulk of the exposure would effectively have rolled off. Unfortunately, over this time, LIBOR exposure has not diminished significantly. And most organizations have fairly ambitious plans to greatly reduce LIBOR exposure over the coming year. Next slide, please. So if we think about LIBOR's last days, we recently had announcements from the LIBOR administrator, the IBA, as well as the LIBOR regulator, the FCA, in terms of how LIBOR cessation will play out. Now, today, if we start on the left side of the slide, today in Indonesia, we have Indonya for the overnight rate based on the 2019 reform, or reform that came in 2019, and JIBOR for the rest of the terms. We also have exposure in Indonesia to US dollar LIBOR and LIBORs with an L of sterling, yen, euro, and Swiss franc, as well as potential other regional benchmarks like SOR, MIFOR, and similar rates. Now, what we expect to happen is sometime around February of next year, there will be a single announcement by the LIBOR administrator, the IBA, and the FCA that will say exactly when LIBOR will cease. This announcement will effectively fix the fallback spread. And the fallback spread is basically compensation for the difference between LIBOR and the new rates that will come in for derivatives that are subject to industry standard ISO protocol, and similar fallback provisions, contractual provisions that are designed to automatically convert LIBOR to the new rates to the extent those are applicable to the contracts. Now, those announcements will basically say LIBOR with an L will discontinue after 2021, December 31st, with the exception of 5 active settings of US dollar LIBOR, which will continue until June 2023. However, that will only be allowed to be used for legacy products. So effectively, by the end of next year, we will not be able to issue new products tied to LIBOR. Now, in terms of how that impacts Indonesia, we did have a question from one of the participants. I think simply put, the LIBOR deadline for US dollar LIBOR, other LIBORs remains the same. It's important to stop issuing new product. It's important to transition legacy instruments to the extent possible in advance of next year, although some instruments could be allowed to remain referencing US dollar LIBOR to the extent they existed before 2021. Next slide, please. So I think the other key theme is LIBOR is found really everywhere around the globe. And while US and Europe has been working on LIBOR transition for about 3.5 years, we have seen significant progress across Asia on LIBOR reform. In Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia, we've seen institutions and worked with institutions over the past 2 years to understand exposure, to develop systems to handle new rates, to issue new products away from LIBOR tied to these new effective rates, new overnight rates, to basically communicate with clients on how to transition. And the public sector has played a major role in that transition, with most jurisdictions issuing Dear CEO letters, similar to what we heard Mr. Dani Hutarbarat talk about, and with very clear expectations on what the institutions are expected to do, from reducing existing LIBOR exposure, issuing new products, remediating IT systems, and client outreach. What we've seen more recently is outside the 4 jurisdictions I mentioned in Asia, we've seen significant progress in places like Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, where those jurisdictions have made just significant progress in setting milestones and really pushing ahead with LIBOR transition. Next slide, slide 5, please. So from a regulatory expectation standpoint, all of the key milestones regulators expect are very much the same. So stopping issuance of new LIBOR. Regulators across US, UK, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia expect cessation of new LIBOR products between end of this year and middle of next year. And we heard the public sector earlier on this webinar actually talk about the need to stop issuance of new LIBOR products as an expectation of the Indonesian regulator as well. We have very clear expectations that IT systems should be ready globally to handle the new risk-free rates. And it's a very complex task because these new rates function differently from the term rates we're used to. We have to actually do the compound calculations ourselves or rely on a provider to produce those. And the payoff structure and knowing the rate in advance is a challenging prospect. In fact, it's one of the wrinkles that has impacted certain products like US mortgages, as well as certain other products like products we find within Islamic finance. And there are ways to move those forward, but it's important to understand what those issues are and really find the best path forward. And it's something we've been working with our clients over the past 2 years. Contract remediation, the expectation is around middle of next year, there's an active push to transition legacy contracts over to new rates, and a very specific recommendation to sign up for the ISDA protocol as soon as possible, preferably by the banks before the effective date of January 25th of next year. So ISDA protocol is a mechanism by which contracts will transition automatically from LIBOR to new rates upon cessation or upon LIBOR being declared non-representative. And it's viewed as an excellent way to transition massive amount of exposure from LIBOR to new rates. And I'm sure the folks from ISDA will talk more about that in the next session. Next slide, please. So if we think about the 8 areas global institutions are focused on, these very much apply to Indonesia. The first stop is issuance of new products tied to risk-free rates, right? So the best way to get out of a ditch is to stop digging, is to stop issuing new LIBOR loans, writing new LIBOR derivatives. So we've worked with our clients to issue loans and derivatives tied to SOFR, SONIA, TONAR, and these other risk-free rates. It's important to understand the client needs and explain the changes to the clients. It's important to make sure systems can handle those new rates, so remediate infrastructure to handle the new conventions and compounding, simple SOFR, compound SOFR, and the various conventions around how those calculations are performed. It's important to know what contracts have LIBOR within them and where LIBOR exists within contracts, contractual provisions. In many cases, the starting point is to find all contracts, which is not always an easy task as at organizations we found. And basically find those terms, propose amendments to those terms, and communicate with clients, effectively conducting client outreach to agree on how to transition those contracts away from LIBOR. Now, there are other key impacts. Treasury, of course, has funding, hedging, funds transfer pricing, asset liability management that must be remediated. And we do tend to find LIBOR everywhere. Risk and valuation models. LIBOR is a key component of valuation models, market risk models, even certain credit risk models. And those must be remediated, because if LIBOR stops and those models and systems expect LIBOR to continue, then the process stops, or the process stops being reliable. Of course, tax and accounting issues, which David will speak to a bit later on. And last but not least, conduct risk. So we've seen a lot of LIBOR scandals 5-6 years ago. And as we transition away from LIBOR, it's important for institutions to very clearly manage communications to clients and make sure that people are treated fairly, that clients are treated fairly, and there is no perception that clients are being taken advantage of, and to have proper controls and communications around this transition. Now, next slide, please. So on slide 7, I briefly touch on what we see these programs look like. So it, of course, starts with mobilizing a team, having a proper governance structure in place, the right people to make decisions, and conducting a quantitative and qualitative impact assessment. Find where LIBOR exists in products, find LIBOR in contracts, find which clients have LIBOR exposure, and then develop a remediation plan to transition away from LIBOR by the cessation date. Now, these plans tend to have work streams, and those work streams are very much focused on the flower slide I just described. So how do I fix new products? How do I talk to my customers? How do I fix the IT systems? How do I fix my models? And so forth. Next slide, please. In terms of progress, you can see key interim milestones on this page, page 8. So from a LIBOR exposure standpoint, institutions are very much focused on stopping new production, also stopping purchases of LIBOR securities into their portfolio. A lot of that work has been completed. At this stage, there are very specific KPIs and reduction targets to LIBOR exposure that we've helped clients establish. And we are seeing active move away from LIBOR in a number of jurisdictions, and expect to see a lot of ramp up, especially in places like the United States in early next year. IT system developments in jurisdictions in Europe, America, Hong Kong, Australia, Japan, Singapore, mostly done or should be done by early next year. Other jurisdictions, it's still a work in progress. New product issuance, we've seen a lot of that on a pilot basis. In terms of sterling, we are seeing a lot of issuance of the new rate, SONIA, as a dominant rate, dominating LIBOR right now in the sterling market. And we expect that transition to occur for US dollar in the coming 6 to 9 months. Client outreach, extensive client outreach has occurred in terms of educating clients, helping them understand the transition. Active client negotiations we expect to take place early next year to mid next year. And again, contract remediation, actually I'll talk about in just 1 second. In terms of, next slide please. So in terms of transition strategy, it's important to understand that there are many ways to get away from LIBOR, right? So one way is to simply close out the position or sell a position. Another way could be implementing ISDA protocol for things that are OTC derivatives and other instruments subject to the ISDA agreements or in scope of the ISDA protocol beyond ISDAs. Highly standardized contracts like LMA, LSTA, APLMA that are actual new templates to use for new products. So it's possible to also find it, basically replace the entire agreement wholesale. Plain vanilla contracts, you can do trade compression. More bespoke instruments, you do have to go clause by clause and remediate that way. Now, each one of this path, each product type has multiple paths you can go down, and you have to consider accounting impacts, business impacts, operational impacts, what you can do, and really decide what the best path forward is. Next slide, please. In terms of systems, I don't have much time to get into the system remediation, but we're finding LIBOR exists in systems across front, middle, and back office. And it's important to really understand where that exposure is and which systems rely on LIBOR and remediate it, as well as develop systems to handle the new rates. Next slide, please. From a contract remediation standpoint, it really comes down to finding the clauses, finding the contracts that have LIBOR exposure, finding the relevant clauses. We work with technology to transition the contractual language from contracts into structured data, basically databases of clauses, developing strategies to remediate those clauses, and preparing basically proposed amendment language for clients, and linking that with client outreach. Next slide, please. From a client outreach standpoint, it is important to tailor communication to each client segment. Some clients need a lot of education and support, for example, corporates, smaller buy-side institutions, while other clients just need to know exactly what the plan is. So importance of client segmentation and appropriate and clear and concise and accurate information is really critical to a client outreach program. And last but not least, I'll cover the conduct risk standpoint. So understanding what conduct risk exists with respect to potential for mis-selling, market disruption, page 13, please. Market disruption, economic value transfer, so changes in value from transition, and a conflict of interest that exists. Very important to embed, understand the risk and embed controls for these risks as institutions transition. Slide 14, please. So I guess with that, I would like to wrap up. I mean, I think we have about 300 people from PwC supporting clients on LIBOR transition in Asia, and well over 1,000 globally. So very much, the folks here would very much welcome an opportunity to come and talk to you about this. And Philip, I'd like to turn it back over to you and look forward to the rest of the panels. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation. I would like to move on now and to the product part. So as we mentioned earlier, transition will affect differently different type of product, and especially around the documentation, the obligation for each of the parties involved in a particular product. And for that, we will have from an ISDA point of view, Jingu, who's head of legal for Asia Pacific. For bonds, and we'll have the ICMA and Mushtaq Apache, who's the managing director for Chief Representative Asia Pacific. And then we'll have for the loan, from a loan perspective, both Adrian Cheng and Tomi Aditomo, who will provide us a view from that. I mean, Adrian is from Herbert Smith Freehill, and Tomi is a partner for HB and Tanjong. I will hand over to Jing. Jing, we have received, I think you might address that point during your presentation. One of the attendee asks, and it's a very fair question, what is the effect for a company that has hedged its LIBOR exposure with interest rate swap? Where this LIBOR transition will change the IRS fixed rate value? Because if you have a fixed rate against LIBOR, you're moving from LIBOR to another reference rate. How actually is what's going to happen? I think that you might have part of the answer with that. The other one might be later on when we talk about client engagement. Over to you, Jing.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for ASIFMA inviting me to speak in this webinar, and also like to thank Refinitiv for sponsoring the event. So in the next 15 minutes, I will go through the ISTA IBOR fallback protocol and the supplement briefly. So we finalized those documents October 23, and the IBOR fallback supplement protocol will come into effect on January 25. So this is a major milestone in the transition away from LIBOR. The East IBOR fallback supplement and protocol cover 13 floating rate options, including a number of Asia Pacific benchmarks. So next slide, please. So as of today, the number of adherence parties to the East IBOR fallback protocol stood at 2,482. Including most of the major banks and many buy-side firms. So we're confident that adherence will continue to increase as we approach January 25. To start with, why do we need fallbacks? I think that's also the answer to the question Philip just mentioned. 2006 is the definitions are generally incorporated by reference into confirmations for uncleared interest rate derivatives and the rule books of CCPs that clear interest rate derivatives. So under the 2006 is the definitions, if an IBOR is not available, including if it is permanently discontinued, current fallbacks require the calculation agent to obtain quotations for what the IBOR should be from major dealers in the relevant interdealer market. So if an IBOR has been permanently discontinued, it's likely that major dealers would be unwilling or unable to give such quotations. So even if quotations available in the near term after the permanent discontinuation, it's unlikely they would be available for each future reset date over the remaining tenor of the long-dated contracts. It's also likely that the quotations could vary materially across the market. So that's why you need the contractual fallback. Next slide, please. Sorry, go back to the previous slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, so all new derivative transactions that incorporate the 2006 is the definitions that are entered into on or after 25 January 2021 will include the triggers and fallbacks set out in the 2006 is the definitions as amended by the IBOR fallbacks supplement. So parties will not need to take any additional steps to include the new fallbacks when entering into new transactions that incorporate the 2006 is the definitions after 25 Jan 2021. As to legacy derivative transactions entered into prior to the effective date of the supplement, the IBOR fallback protocol will enable market participants to choose to incorporate the fallbacks into their legacy trades with counterparties that also opt to adhere to the protocol. Parties could also agree to incorporate the new fallbacks by bilaterally amending their legacy non-clear contracts by using one of the templates published by ISTA. Clearinghouses have indicated they will use the powers in their rulebooks to implement fallbacks in all of their legacy cleared derivative transactions as of the effective date of the supplement. Next slide. Thank you. So this slide sets out the 13 floating rate options covered by the ISTA IBOR fallback supplement and protocol. Bloomberg Index Services Limited is publishing all relevant IBORs fallbacks except for SOAR and TIBOR fix. So Bloomberg currently publishes this information on an indicative basis, except for CDOR 6 months and 12 months. This is because an indexation event in respect of CDOR 6 and 12 months have occurred. Therefore, the spread adjustment has been fixed for the 2 tenors of CDOR. So other than the 2 tenors of CDOR, for the rest of the IBOR, the fallback adjustment are currently published on an indicative basis. The fallbacks for SOR and Thai baht fix are published by ABS and Bank of Thailand, respectively. So they are the administrator of SOR and Thai baht fix. A number of key Asia benchmarks are synthetic benchmarks derived by applying a forward FX curve to the US dollar LIBOR curve. So when US dollar LIBOR is no longer available after the end of 2021, the viability of those benchmarks is also in doubt. So those FX swap implied benchmarks include SOR in Singapore, Thai baht fix in Thailand, MIFOR in India, and the Philippine reference rate used in the Philippines. The East IBOR fallback protocol and supplement have covered SOR and Thai baht fix, and we are in discussion with MIFOR and the Philippine reference bank rate administrator regarding a documentation solution for the fallbacks of the two benchmarks, as we're sometime next year. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So I will start from the question, what rates have been chosen as fallbacks for the IBORs? The fallback rates are the risk-free rates for the relevant currency chosen by the respective national working group. So the IBOR fallback supplement is a supplement to the 2006 Easter definitions, as I just mentioned. The supplement updates the rate options to include new triggers and fallbacks in the event of a permanent cessation, and for LIBOR rate options, non-representativeness of the relevant rate. So this is often referred as a pre-cessation. Each rate option will first fall back to a published fallback rate calculated based on a term-adjusted risk-free rate for the relevant currency, plus a spread, and then to further specific fallbacks if that published fallback rate is discontinued. In other words, the relevant floating rate option, including fallbacks to fallbacks, there is a waterfall of fallbacks included in the definition to future-proof the document. The adjusted risk-free rate in the relevant currency would apply, as I mentioned, as fallback following a permanent cessation of the IBOR in that currency. For SOR and Thai baht fix, they are defined as a LIBOR rate option. So the fallbacks for those two currencies will apply following a determination by the FCA that LIBOR in the currency is no longer representative of its underlying market, or a permanent cessation of US dollar LIBOR. Okay, next slide, please. Just very briefly on the term and spread adjustment. So there are structural differences between the IBORs and IFRs. So IBORs are available in multiple tenors, where IFRs are overnight rates. So the IBORs also incorporate a bank credit risk premium and other factors. So adjustments are therefore needed to the IFRs to ensure contracts originally negotiated to reference to IBOR continue to meet the original objectives of the counterparties to the maximum extent possible once the fallback takes effect. So following a series of industry consultations on adjustment methodologies, the IFRs will be compounded over the relevant IBOR period, and the spread adjustment will be added to the compounded rate. The spread adjustment will be based on the median over 5-year period of the historic differences between the IBOR in the relevant tenor and the relevant IFR compounded over each corresponding period. To deal with the operational difficulty of making a payment based on a rate that is only known at the end of the calculation period, the rate will be backward shifted for 2 business days. Okay, as I mentioned, ISTA announced that following a competitive request for proposal process, Bloomberg was selected to act as independent third-party vendor to produce and publish the compounded setting arrears rate, the spread adjustment, and the all-in fallback rate for all relevant IBORs except of SOR and Thai baht fix. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, a very brief word. Sorry, go back to the previous slide. Okay, thank you. A very brief word on SOAR and type fix. In the documents, SOAR and type fix, each is defined a LIBOR rate option. So therefore, the index cessation event in respect of SOAR and type fix is triggered by a permanent cessation or pre-cessation of a US dollar LIBOR. Another issue to note is there is a new section 8.5, which has been introduced to the 2006 definitions by the supplement. So what the section 8.5 says is to provide when a particular tenor of IBOR is discontinued, but there are still at least two other tenors which are available. One is shorter, one is longer. Then the rate for the reset date will be determined by interpolating between the next shorter and next longer available IBOR tenors. So this section 8.5 has been disapplied for SOAR and type fix. The reason is because for SOAR and type fix, if a dollar LIBOR is discontinued, which SOAR and type fix uses to calculate their number, the ABS and Bank of Thailand will continue to publish the respective SOAR and type fixed tenor based on the interpolated US dollar LIBOR. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I only have a few minutes left, so we'll be wrap up very quickly. A brief word on IST IBOR fallback protocol. So the amendments introduced by the protocol are made to the protocol cover documents on the ladder of the implementation date and the protocol effective date, which is Jan 25, 2022. So between two parties who have sent adherence letters to IST, the protocol is effective on the date IST accepts an adherence letter from the later of the two parties. So that's referred to as implementation date. So if both parties adhere to the protocol before the protocol effective date, the amendments will be effective on the protocol effective date, i.e. Jan 25. If one or both parties adhere to the protocol after the protocol effective date, the amendments will be effective on the implementation date. The protocol will cover the IST master agreement, credit support document, and IST confirmations. It will also cover a non-additional additional IST master agreement, additional credit support documents, and confirmations supplement forms part of the non-IST master agreement. So as long as they either incorporate a covered IST definition booklet or they reference IBOR as defined in the IST definition booklet, or they reference IBOR however it's defined. In terms of the list of the non-IST master agreement credit support documents covered by the protocol, the list is included in the protocol. One of the example is the GMRA, the Global Master Repurchase Agreement. That is also a covered protocol master agreement. Next slide. Okay, I just want to mention IST also published a number of bilateral templates and language to facilitate parties to incorporate the terms of the protocol to their contracts, and they could also use a template language to exclude certain trades or add additional trades into the your bilateral agreements. IST has published a webinar on IST website, which gives the overview of the bilateral template. I would encourage everyone to go to the IST website to listen to the recording. So I won't repeat the content in detail during the seminar due to limited time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to mention there on the IST website, there is a benchmark reform hub, and we have put a lot of information, including the IBOR fallback fact sheet, and also webinars and protocol supplement, text of the protocol supplement, and the FAQs on that website. So I would encourage one to go to the IST website to look for the relevant information. So that's the end of my presentation. I will now pass over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jin. Mushtaq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Philippe, and thank you to ASIFMA for organizing this very important webinar. I think it's well put together, and a lot of very important voices here on this complex problem. I'd also like to thank Bank of Indonesia for their leadership, and particularly Pak Doni for really leading the market and pushing the market for this very necessary transition. So my name is Mushtaq. I'm from ICMA. We cover the bond markets, and I'll speak for a few minutes about benchmark issues related to the international bond market generally, although this applies to LIBOR-linked floating rate notes issued by Indonesian borrowers. So will be relevant for those floating rate note issuers and investors, perhaps in other Asian markets. So the overall message from ICMA, just like with everybody else, is that the market should prepare for a cessation of LIBOR at the end of 2021. As many of you know, until recently, this date was the date that authorities and the market were working towards across all LIBOR, currency, and tenor pairings. However, last month, there were a series of announcements on the official sector and from the exchanges indicating that, subject to consultation, the most liquid US dollar LIBOR tenors would be continued until mid-2023 in order to allow the bulk of legacy transactions to mature. However, subject to certain very limited exceptions, US dollar LIBOR would not be available for any new business from the end of 2021. So the end of 2021 is still a key milestone. And as Sergei Volkov very eloquently put it, the best way to get out of a ditch is to stop digging. So we at ICMA would very much recommend that new issuance linked to LIBOR cease altogether as early as possible. And LIBOR, even if it continues in certain respects, cannot be used for new issuance after 2021. So in the bond market, authorities have consistently stated and still state that the best thing to do is transition actively any instruments that are already linked to LIBOR and will mature after the end of 2021. So if you have LIBOR-linked bonds, you need to start thinking about how to transition them right away. Now, in the US dollar floating rate note market, we've seen significant new issuance linked directly to the risk-free rate SOFR, which is the identified alternative to US dollar LIBOR. A recent letter from the ARC, which is the official sector working group looking at the transition in the United States, stated that approximately 820 billion US dollar notional in floating rate debt instruments tied to SOFR have been issued since SOFR's publication. However, even today, we are still in parallel seeing new issuance, even today, linked to US dollar LIBOR across international markets. And much of this issuance is in the Asia Pacific region. I'll briefly mention other currencies. In sterling LIBOR and GBP LIBOR, new issuance linked to LIBOR has virtually ceased. So this problem is slowly going away. We're a bit confident that we can manage this. And in Asia, there's also significant new issuance in yen-denominated LIBOR, although this is mainly in Japan and out of Japan, but could be relevant for some investors in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Now, if the issuance of LIBOR-linked bonds is unavoidable, and we have heard this from the market, then we strongly recommend to use robust fallbacks to risk-free rates. For the US dollar LIBOR market, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee in the US, or the ARRC, has already produced fallback language for new US dollar LIBOR floating rate note contracts. And we recommend this to be used from ICMA. Note, this is applicable only to new US dollar denominated floating rate notes. But the US authorities have also said, including the Fed, that as good as this fallback language may be, simply relying on the fallback language to transition still gives rise to a number of operational risks and economic risks. And so if you have to issue LIBOR bonds, please go ahead with the official fallbacks, but the best choice is still to be moving to reference alternative rates such as SOFR. The language now for US dollar LIBOR is fairly standardized as a matter of market practice. And given the move away from LIBOR issuance and towards issuance of bonds referencing alternative rates such as SOFR, the market consensus is that it's not a priority to publish standard language now, because the ARC already has that fallback language for US dollar LIBOR. Okay, one more thing to emphasize is that any new fallback language will apply to new issuances of FRNs only. It will not work retroactively to any bonds already in issue. Next slide, please. Now, if we take the pool of outstanding bonds that are linked to LIBOR, okay, it's helpful to divide this into three categories, at least for my own conceptual comprehension. The first category is those maturing before the end of 2021, or in some cases for US dollar LIBOR before mid-2023. Okay, these are ones that are maturing before LIBOR ends. Now, we don't have to worry about these too much because they will not be affected by the cessation of LIBOR that takes place after their maturity. They'll just mature, LIBOR will still exist, not much of a problem. That's good. The second category is new LIBOR-linked bonds that are issued from around mid-2017 when the market became aware that LIBOR would end. Now, these typically, but we're not sure that all of them do, include fallbacks designed to operate so that the bond starts to reference a risk-free rate. In other words, it's already baked into these bonds that once LIBOR doesn't exist anymore, the new rate will be the risk-free rate. So again, they're not as problematic. Okay. The third category, though, is the most tricky. These are bonds referencing LIBOR which mature beyond mid-2023 for US dollar LIBOR, or beyond the end of 2021 for other LIBOR currencies, and that do not have fallbacks to another risk-free rate. All right, these are called in the market now legacy bonds. So basically what these are bonds that are maturing after LIBOR ends, but they don't fall back to a risk-free rate in a very efficient manner. So when it comes to this third category, how big is the problem? Well, market estimates have indicated that legacy bonds are at least 800 billion US dollar globally. Most of this is denominated in US dollars, about 80%. And in Asia, a preliminary analysis from Bloomberg shows us that more than 250 billion US dollars in notional of LIBOR-linked notes across more than 800 issues are maturing from 2022 onwards, issued by Asian corporates, banks, and financial institutions. And the analysis in a preliminary way shows that more than a third of these issues have inadequate fallbacks or no fallbacks at all. So this tough legacy problem is actually a major issue in the Asia-Pacific region. So what will happen to these legacy bonds once LIBOR ceases to exist? Well, what would happen is that the rate would just go basically to a fixed rate. It will just go to the last LIBOR rate that was quoted, and it will effectively cease to become a floating rate instrument. This is clearly a potential commercial and even legal problem for both issuers and investors. Next slide, please. So what are the different options? Okay, publicly issued bonds pose different issues to loans and derivatives, and in some ways more complicated, simply because they're not bilateral or syndicated to a small group. So instead of a bilateral negotiation to change the terms in the context of loans, or in contrast to derivatives, which, while much more in terms of notional, have a much more straightforward process, which is the protocol process, bonds do not have anything similar. So it's much more difficult to change the terms of the bonds. So again, while the number and the amount of bonds that have this problem are much less, the problem in some ways is much more difficult to solve. Now, for bonds that are under English law, you can do something called a consent solicitation, which means that if you get more than a majority, usually about 75% of the investors represented, to agree to the change of the terms, then you can change the bonds to a new rate or to a new interest rate methodology. And this is already being done in the UK context with some success. Next slide, please. The authorities in the UK are also aware of this problem. So in the UK, the government's put forward draft legislation that can direct the LIBOR administrator to change the methodology for LIBOR across all currency tenor pairings, if doing so would protect consumers and market integrity. So in other words, even if these bonds are not able to be changed in the UK, and probably under English law, then there could be a legislative solution to do that somewhat automatically by changing the methodology of LIBOR in some fashion, although the details of this are not certain. Next slide, please. Now, there's also a possible United States legislative proposal. And just for background here, contracts under New York law, so bonds under New York law, are much more difficult to change than those under English law. Why is that? Well, traditionally and in practice, you can amend the terms of an English law bond by 75% of the investors. But with New York law governed bonds, it usually takes 100%. So it's much, much more difficult to get that full consent of bondholders to amend the bonds. It's a very, very difficult and risky process. So there's a legislative proposal out of the US. And what that would do is it would basically have the effect that the SOFR fallbacks and credit adjustment spread would automatically apply to either contracts with no fallbacks or contracts which fall back to a LIBOR-based rate. Okay, so basically it would be legislation that automatically changed the contracts. Now, this is also kind of complicated in terms of the legislative procedure and the details and so forth. So we don't want to recommend that market participants sort of rely on this as a solution. Again, the best solution is to try not to issue any more US dollar LIBOR bonds to avoid any trouble or uncertainty with respect to this legislation. Next slide, please. And finally, I should just mention that there is also a benchmark regulation proposal at the European level by the EU. And again, without going into details, this would operate to try to remedy contracts in the EU, most likely under European law, to make them workable once LIBOR ceases to exist. But I think this is not as relevant to Asia, given that Asian bonds linked to LIBOR are generally under New York English law, and to some extent Japanese law as well. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on Japanese law, but if that is a problem for you, please feel free to contact me outside, or we can get you to the right experts. Next slide, please. I should also mention, just for completeness sake, that other than issuing new bonds linked to risk-free rates, issuing robust LIBOR-linked bonds with adequate fallbacks to risk-free rates, and these legislative proposals and contractual amendment provisions, there are some other options, right? So one option is for issuers to buy back the bonds by way of a tender offer or open market repurchase, and then issue new bonds with the risk-free rates included. But this would actually probably add additional layers of complexity. It has its own procedural issues and commercial tensions. And the final option, which perhaps may be the only option in some cases, is simply to let the bonds operate according to their terms. Just operate as written in the contracts, in which case these floating rate notes will revert to fixed rate, even if this was not anticipated by the issuer or the investors. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that's it. So in closing, I'd just like to mention briefly that there are other risks related to the transition from LIBOR that have been mentioned before, especially by PwC. Risks of hedging mismatches, you have to think about this cross-asset. Recharacterization risk of capital instruments, if they go from floating to fixed, changes the economics. Tax events, accounting implications, and potential mis-selling or conduct risks if you are changing or not changing the terms of the bonds. So we at ICMA, again, our expertise is on the bond side. If you have any questions about how the transition from LIBOR affects the bond markets, then we're very happy to speak with you bilaterally or to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mushtaq. And I guess that some of this information is also available on your website.
Yes, thanks for the plug. We have an extensive benchmark hub on the ICMA website, and we actually also have an Asia Pacific resource hub for specific to benchmarks as well.
Okay.
So we invite you to look at those. It not only has many of these official sector announcements and guidelines and speeches and so forth, but also ICMA analyses of the bond markets and the various options and procedures available.
Thank you, Mushtaq. So now that we've gone through the derivatives, the bonds, I think we're probably going to what I would think is probably the most, not the complicated asset, but asset class, certainly probably the most complicated one when it comes down to that transition. To walk us through what has been done and needs to be done from a loan perspective. As I said earlier, we'll have a chance of having here Adrian Chang, who's a partner for Urban Smith Freehills, is based in Singapore, and also Tommy Aditomo, who's partner for HB and Tanjong. Tommy, Adrian, the floor is yours.
Hi, Philip. Thank you for the chances to speak here in a ASIFMA event. Hello all. I think hope you are all staying well and healthy. So I guess me and Adrian here now will talk a little bit about the legal aspect on the loan documentations, where when building a strategy in the terms of IBOR transition in the Indonesian loan market. Next slide. So I guess in terms of the agenda for myself and Adrian, we will talk a little bit about Indonesian market update, and then we are talking about the strategy, about the documentation. We are talking about the loans, derivative, and the bond documentation. Next. Yeah, I guess in terms of Indonesian loan market here, as you may be aware, that there's no specific laws and regulation to tackle the issues on the IBOR transition in Indonesia. But I guess based on what we heard from Pak Doni from Indonesia, I guess it is very positive to know that, about Indonesia established a special team to coordinate this and to assess and also to prepare the transition, so we have a smooth transition upon the abolition of LIBOR. So in terms of the other reference rate that being used, I guess Indonesian loan market in a broader sense remains using LIBOR, even though there's Indonia and also JIBOR in place. So I guess in terms of the transition, I guess the wait and see approach is taken to follow the international development on how the transition will be made. And in terms of loan documentation wise, I guess we'll expect that the Indonesian loan market will follow as to how the Indonesian market procedure for the amending and modifying that documents, of course with the sufficient adjustment from Indonesian law aspect of it. I think that's why it's important to track the latest observation on this, because I think the insight from my colleagues Adrian Cheng here will be very useful. Next, Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tommy. Can you hear? Okay. Have we switched speakers, Tommy?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tommy. Appreciate that. Okay, so for the next part of the presentation, we've got, in fact, the slide pack that we've presented will include some information on ISDAs and what we're seeing also in the bond market, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus really on the loan markets, given that the previous two speakers were looking at the derivative market and the bond market. So looking at the loan market, in terms of the existing loans that are currently papered using the template documents recommended by the Loan Market Association or the Asia Pacific Loan Market Association. Those of you that are familiar with those documents may have already spotted that there are certain embedded provisions that partially address the transition issue. So there are existing fallback provisions which present a sort of waterfall of options in the event of the unavailability of LIBOR. These fallback provisions have at its roots, though, really the response to the 2008 GFC. And they're really there only to address what happens when LIBOR is temporarily not available. And actually, they don't really cater for the complete cessation of LIBOR. So I think, one thing just to be a little bit careful about this is that, whereas it looks on paper sometimes for people not familiar with the documentation as if this issue is already dealt with, but in reality, it's not. For instance, most of these fallback provisions, the ultimate fallback is really a reference point by which interest rates can be determined by reference to the cost of funds actual cost of funds for lenders. But that solution is obviously not going to be particularly palatable from the borrower's perspective. Also, if you're falling back to individual bank submissions on their specific cost of funds, that is a nightmare in terms of administering the options from a agency perspective. So the bottom line, unfortunately, is that notwithstanding the fact that in current documents, you've got current APLMA, LMA recommended form documents, you've got these fallback provisions, they just don't provide a satisfactory long-term solution to the transition away from LIBOR. The other interesting provisions that are currently in the LMA, APLMA recommended form documents that people may be familiar with is that there is actually a new provision, or fairly new provision, which was introduced in 2018 with LIBOR transition in mind. There's actually, a couple of pages of provisions which seem to address the LIBOR cessation issue, but from a legal perspective, unfortunately, that those fallback provisions only operate really as an agreement to agree. So to put it differently, the issue is flagged in the documents, but it's not really solved. And actually, if you read the clause carefully, it's really about the parties coming back to agree. And then once you've agreed the solution, you then have to repaper it and amend the document. So bottom line, the current forward provisions which are embedded in the LMA and APLMA recommended forms don't quite get us there. Going to touch on next slide, please. Right, I'm going to touch on amendments to the legacy loans in a second. But before that, I think it is worth bearing in mind that in 2019, the Loan Market Association published exposure drafts for investment grade facilities where LIBOR is effectively replaced by SONIA for sterling loans and SOFR for dollar loans. So these drafts were there really to they're drafts. I sort of hasten to add that they're drafts, and they were intended to draw comments from the market participants and to start facilitating awareness of the issues involved in structuring syndicated loans, which reference the RFRs, and really to be used as a starting point for trying to develop a market position on alternatives to LIBOR. In fact, these drafts have since been used as a basis for some first mover transactions in 2020, and there are now a handful of new loans out there in the market, certainly in the London market, which no longer reference LIBOR but use RFRs instead. So that's pretty helpful. One point to note, though, is that while these exposure drafts have been used, really to kind of road test some of the issues relating to these use of the RFRs, how they're calculated, because as you've heard from previous speakers, there's some issues around whether how to adapt them for term loans, which because they're overnight rates as opposed to forward-looking rates, etc. The reality, though, is that there hasn't been sufficient market practice developed since these first mover deals for the LMA to produce recommended form documents based on RRRs. So I just sort of caution that whilst these documents are there and very helpful starting points, they're not the same as the sort of recommended forms for your usual deals. And actually, the current recommended reforms under the LMA and APLMA still reference LIBOR with the imperfect fallback options that I touched on earlier. Okay, next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so it's worth noting that building off the work that the LMA has done, the Asia Pacific Loan Market Association has itself put out its own exposure drafts where LIBOR is replaced by USD SOFR. The deadline for comments was this month. I think it's first week of December. But my understanding from some of my colleagues that sit on the APLMA Docs Committee is that unfortunately they've received very little market feedback on the exposure drafts as of late. So it's again one of those sort of unfortunate things where I think it's still to be tested in that sense. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. Okay, so turning then to some of the issues relating to the amending of legacy loans, given that what I've just said earlier about the existing provisions in the existing fallback provisions in legacy loan documents being, I guess, insufficient to really deal with the cessation of LIBOR. Unfortunately, this repapering exercise of legacy loans is going to be somewhat complicated, especially in the world of syndicated loans, because unlike the ISDA protocol, for instance, there is no multilateral contractual amendment mechanism that's going to just simply fix it through the waving of a magic wand, unfortunately. So we're going to be faced with the loan market's going to be faced with amendments that are going to have to be effected pretty much on a deal-by-deal basis, in accordance with the relevant terms of the loan agreement. So it's a big exercise. Helpfully, though, the LMA has produced a draft legacy transition rate selection agreement to try and facilitate this transition where there are large syndicated facilities and syndicates involved. This document is going to need to be signed by the requisite quorum of banks, usually the majority lenders and the borrower. And the approach that the LMA are taking to this is to try to mirror, I guess, what's being done in the secondary trading market, where the intention is to try to streamline the amendment process by using one form of agreement across transactions. That said, the way this document works is that it sets out the replacement reference rate and also embodies the commercial terms that need to be changed as a consequence of the replacement. But then it authorizes the facility agent and the borrower to then go away to agree the actual drafting of the changes that need to be made to the legacy loan agreement, which then of itself would have to be separately documented in the amendment agreement. So what you've got is effectively a two-stage process where you sign up first a rate selection agreement and then followed by actual amendments that have to be separately agreed between the agent and the borrower. I think in practice, we suspect that unless you are looking at large syndicates, it actually may be just be more efficient to go straight to the amendment agreement rather than go through this two-stage process. At one point on this, though, that I ought to kind of highlight, I guess, is that as things stand, the LMA is not currently proposing to produce a recommended form amendment agreement. And so it will, the expectation is that these are going to be fairly bespoke. And in any event, I suspect in practice, because of the complexity of the changes that will need to be made, in the early days, certainly we're anticipating that simple amendment agreements may not be the easiest way forward, because you probably are going to want to amend and restate facility agreements in their entirety. So I think that's something just to bear in mind. Next slide, please, Flora. Okay, so inevitably, once you're talking about these amendment exercises, there will be issues that the market is going to have to address and think about. One of them is the cost of this. Who should bear these? Does this fall back onto the customers or the borrowers, or will the industry pick it, or the banks pick this up? There are a whole bunch of other issues which also will need to be thought through and considered in the light of the amendments that need to be effected in relation to the legacy loans A good example is what the market position is going to be on legal opinions. These changes are, for all intents and purposes, largely administrative in nature, but will banks want law firms to issue legal opinions in the same way as legal opinions are required to be issued when you close a deal day one? It's a position which is yet to be settled and needs to be thought through. Another issue that will also need to be considered, and this will depend on depends on jurisdiction. Will depend really on jurisdictional issues. It's really in relation to secured loans, and the question there is, when you start to repaper and amend and make these amendments to deal with the transition away from LIBOR, does that then need to be followed up also with confirmatory or supplemental security? Again, if you go down that route, it'll add to the cost of repapering the deal. So an issue there that will need to be borne in mind going forward. Okay, next slide. I think the rest of this really has already been covered by the previous speakers. So I think what I'm just going to call it a day there and hand over back to Philippe.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Tommy. And indeed, I mean the loan market is and the challenges around the repapering of the loan in the loan side will definitely be probably one of the biggest challenge. My view is for the industry. But thank you very much for your insight. Now let's move on, and we're going now to cover. And we've covered the product side. We're going to cover the technology side, and for that we'll have Edmund Lee from Bloomberg, who will provide us an overview of the practical challenge for the IBOR transition, but from a data and infrastructure perspective. Edmund, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip.
Just a kind reminder, we are already 10 minutes late, so let's make all sure going forward that we stick to our time.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Bloomberg, we thank ASIFMA for giving us the opportunity to share Bloomberg's perspective based on clients' engagements on benchmark reform and the problem that our customers is trying to solve, which is, why does LIBOR transition matter? How do you start? The internal and external communications to stakeholders and clients. So the two key interconnected components is data, infrastructure, and wrapping this around with communications. Next slide, please. Now, the growing number of signatories to ISDA's 2020 IBOR fallbacks protocol shows a broad range of market participants covering corporates, insurance, finance houses, mutual funds, buy-side securities houses, and the list goes on. The usage of LIBOR, the move away, the implications of from an IBOR to RFR benchmark impacts the architecture of the industry. So the start of how do we begin is to assess the impact of your workflow through the trade lifecycle analysis. Now, in the inner circle, it encompasses all the kit items essential covering transition information, trade execution tools, trade data, fallback data, calculations, product pricing, and risk management. Now, starting from on the right side down to the left, at number one, we start off working with correct information sources, the abilities to draw out fallback clauses, and then applying transition scenarios. The next stage will be to work on compression by trading transition instruments like the basis, terminate your LIBOR linked cash flows, collapse the LIBOR OIS basis positions, and then rebuild the portfolio onto RFR OIS rates. Then in box 3, where fallbacks may be triggered in the transition phase, and downstreaming the activity into risk and valuation systems. And then lastly, in box 4, ingesting these new calculations, the various range of compounding in arrears payment types and calculation conventions. The main through line we see is how data interacts throughout the infrastructure. Next slide, please. In an example of how to start work, my colleagues are working with firms to implement action plans to address large-scale implications impact on benchmark transition activity. It covers operating model, data, technology, and the process of communication, the effort required to all stakeholders. So as changes evolve at different phases, different speeds, the magnitude of system builds can be quite huge. The focus is on the data and infrastructure required for transition. Developing the architecture as consensus on market conventions converges. Now, here's an example that covers overcoming the challenges of making the tangible start. Where to locate information to enable analysis around LIBOR transition. So with data, you got to draw in your existing exposure, finding the information on RFR instruments and securities, and then combining that with the fallback data points across the derivatives and cash portfolios across all your books and the relevant contracts. Then bringing these across the infrastructure for the pricing of RFR instruments, assessing it via electronic data and trade capture, and then managing that valuation impact and scenarios on a portfolio basis. Next slide, please. Now, with that, the nuances around cash legacy products, drawing out contractual waterfalls, testing spread adjustment layers, and managing the value transfer activity, and then incorporating it in the new RFR environment with multiple payment types depending on who your clients are. New calculators is needed to handle these conventions. Now, the good thing is the solutions and tools covering the transition data sets and working on the number crunching solutions is available today. This means that your firm can start work on producing the answers and approaches to questions on preparations for the shift to RFR. In the previous in this slide, we see that along with the dollar SOFR rate, the Indonesian OIS, which is considered to be a near risk-free rate, is available for use. It is also heartening to note that the authorities and IFEMC have started efforts on awareness with market participants on benchmark discontinuity. Next slide, please. Now, here's another example where Bloomberg has broken down the IBOR transition process impact around multiple work streams occurring on the simultaneous front. We are working with clients, have seen them adopt a holistic approach in assessing the impact on transition, identifying gaps in the existing systems, requirements of new data sets, quantifying the impact from a valuation perspective through 8 different areas. Now, the first part impacts the front office trading, ensuring your front office can handle trading of new RFR instruments, as well as training people with how to explain the economic impact to both your customers and internal stakeholders. The second focuses on operation side sorting, systems to handle the daily compounding interest, calculation cash flows, or evaluate the impact of PI and CSA change. Then contracts, identify all LIBOR-linked exposures, ascertain what the fallback provisions are. Is a technology and database ready to enable quick mapping, to classify types of fallback provisions, and the possible complexity in renegotiation? The fourth focus on regulatory compliance. Are you able to time your action plan to match the timeline set by the regulators? Next slide, please. Now on to the other following business areas. The fifth focuses on treasury and funding operations to switch the basis of your funding and hedging to the new RFRs. The next is an area where most of our clients have difficulty with, which is valuation and market risk. As we switch from a LIBOR discounting to the new RFR discounting regime, you will need to ensure that your system can handle the pricing and calculation of risk exposures under both discounting bases. The last 2 areas focuses on accounting, finance, and IT infrastructure. Tracking accounting, taxation changes, and how it impacts operations. The likely work on several reference rate replacement scenarios so that the affected variables can be tested on how to handle the complexity of the changes. In all, new data and conventions creates a wide spectrum of risk and operational adjustments for market participants across all business areas. And these are just the main hardware elements of it. All these departments and internal working groups within the organization, are they effectively training people for the change, enhancing skill sets and new knowledge, managing their communication effectively to bring all the key departments together? Next slide, please. Now, to support our clients' needs, Bloomberg focuses on the data and infrastructure elements of LIBOR transition, where we develop our system architecture as consensus on market convention converges. These cover the transition challenges the industry faces, the data needed, and how to move that data in a usable way around departments' infrastructure. Now on data, you have things like ISDA fallbacks, the waterfall fallback for cache, dataset specifics for transition, RFR, and even how and what client-facing representatives of a firm would need for client engagement. In the infrastructure side, you have the PI and CSA shift for risk, the type of RFR type calculations, analytics on new data, adoption of RFR workflow to electronic trading for the compression over to RFR and supporting the infrastructure across the business units. Now, wrapping around this, Bloomberg has also added the communication segment where we are working with clients on how to bring the relevant message through tailored LIBOR transition masterclass training on key communication elements and how to share this information across to client-facing departments and internal stakeholders. Next slide, please. As covered by Jingu from ISDA earlier, ISDA is implementing adjusted versions of the RFR to serve as IBOR fallbacks. ISDA selected Bloomberg as the official adjustment service vendor. At the moment, we are publishing indicative rates based on historical values available. The latest risk-free rates that are published on a daily basis for all the 11 rate sets. This indicative rates cover compounded in arrears calculation to align with IBOR term structures, a 5-year median spread calculation, and the all-in fallback for the 11 rate sets. Now, we recommend that users also refer to the ruble for concise details around LIBOR fallback data. Having the necessary data and calculators and infrastructure in place would help give you the what-if scenarios as you map out the where and what components you need to make changes. Now, if you're a Bloomberg user, you can see this on FBAC Go. It is also freely available on the website on a 24-hour delayed basis at bloomberg.com/LIBOR. And we also have redistributors who have taken it under license to distribute this to their client network. I would be happy to go through in detail on the methodology of the fallback calculations at another time. And you can reach out to me directly on my bloomberg.net email address. Next slide, please. Now, in summary, I have shared Bloomberg's take on the 3 key areas of benchmark transition. Based on our engagements with clients and working with them on the data and infrastructure program, which includes communication framework set up to monitor industry progress timelines, actions to involve internal and external stakeholders. With data, fallback data for derivatives and cash exists today. RFR data, the ability to run quality control for consistency, working it through the calculators and models across all departments in a firm, can be started, get it tested, and implement it to production today. Now, with that on data, systems can then start work on scenarios and impact analysis. There will be downstream adjustments on CSA, collateral, and big data. Infrastructure needs to be open to tackle multiple rate regimes and a host of known and unknown conventions not yet resolved today. This would require a bit of investment on multiple levels. And as the work in data and infrastructure takes place, we have effectively 13 months or lesser to work with our clients and stakeholders to have them ready for transition by the end of next year. We have to start the communication process. On client communication and disclosures, active market engagement and monitoring can run concurrently. We are seeing that some clients have started engagements with clients on risk, plans, economic change preference. To support this communication activity, my colleagues are actively working with some clients on running knowledge transfer programs, focusing on risk and operations departments, internal communication, and client-facing departments. Now, in our journey for LIBOR transition, there will be many components that you will need to address. As we cope with the many changes, we encourage you to examine your data, infrastructure, and communication readiness. Having these 3 in place will provide you with a tangible start while navigating through the details and technicalities that continues to develop. Now, on that note, thank you for your time. Any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. We look forward to working in the industry and together towards a smooth transition. Back to you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Edmund. And we have indeed a couple of questions, and one, if I mean you could go on the chat to get the info, the answer there. If you see, this one is really around the capability to accurately generate and manage existing exposure information for banks. I think it's something that you should be answering. The other one is regarding once the spread adjustment is fixed, will Bloomberg still publish the fallback rates? My understanding is yes, they will publish.
That's correct.
The new interest rate.
That's correct. I'll just take one question for the moment, and then after that, maybe the rest I'll just answer online, either myself or my other counterparts from Refinitiv. So once the spread adjustment is fixed, and I'll use the FBAC example. If you go to the CDOR, you will see that the 6 months and the 12 months spread is already fixed, and Bloomberg continues to publish the fix on a repeated basis, and that's the spread adjustment, right? So that's how it works. More details, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll type the answer in as well on the chat. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esmond. Moving on now, I think that now we've talked about the technical part, the product side, and the like. Now we're going to see, I mean, how practically financial institutions are dealing with that. And we also, as I said, I'm very fortunate to also have the regulator on board. So we'll have a look at the financial institution, the banks onshore in Indonesia, the regional banks and the global banks, and also the regulators. So to moderate the panel, we have Ryan Page from Refinitiv, and on the panel we'll have Pak Branco for Bank Central Asia, Tony from OJK, and Thierry Foy from Standard Chartered. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Philippe. Thank you to ASIFMA as well, and to the Indonesia Foreign Exchange Market Committee for organising today's event. It's been a fantastic event so far, and we've heard a lot from industry and market experts on, I guess, why this transition matters. It's a privilege to be moderating today's panel, where we'll be talking to a number of market participants, as well as having OJK representation to talk about how financial institutions within Indonesia are actually approaching it from a practical sense. So we'll be looking at implementation and conduct issues. As Pardoni mentioned in his opening remarks, the Bank Readiness Survey surveyed 39 respondents within the Indonesian financial markets, of which 30 mentioned they had LIBOR exposure. 25 of those have a plan, and 18 of those have a team ready to go. So hoping to hear more from the panelists on the nature of those teams, the structure of that process that firms are going through. I think another important thing in Pardoni's opening remarks were the potential effect on internal business process, right? So I think that speaks volume. At the moment, we've heard a lot about academically and theoretically what this transition means, but hoping in this panel that we'll delve into a more practical and actual hands-on sense of what changes and what business processes require change and how firms will be addressing that. So with that, I might pass over to Pak Branco initially from Bank of Central Asia to give us some insight into how Bank of Central Asia is approaching the transition. How do they have a team set up to approach the transition? Is that owned by Treasury? Is that owned by a group function? Just to get a sense of how they're approaching it. Pak Branco, over to you.
Sorry, it was still muted when I was talking. So
no problems.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you also, Philip and ASIFMA, for inviting us. In BCA, we are early in the process of identifying the exposure, identifying the customers, identifying the counterparties that are exposed to the change. The coordination, therefore, is at present, still jointly led by Treasury as well as Finance Division. The discussion has taken place a number of times already. involving treasury, credit units, as well as international banking, where the exposures are. We are lucky that actually we are not that much exposed on the US dollar or foreign currency lending, for example, or derivatives. But we have identified that there are exposure over to 2021. So we will be doing the transition. Customers, some of them we have contacted, some of them are aware, some of them are not, some of them are regional customers, some of them are global customers. Again, it varies. Some of them are aware, some of them are not with regard to the transition from LIBOR. However, most of them are most willing to hear how banks are going to approach the change. For those who are regionally managed and globally managed, they are still waiting. Majority of them are still waiting to hear from either their regional office or their global office as to the change. So most of them have not decided how they are going to approach this, and they need more information. So informally, we have already contacted customers, but probably starting next year, January, we will be contacting these customers more closely to see and to present to them what we are going to propose as a transition from LIBOR to next benchmark. As far as BCA is concerned, actually we started this July last year. Most exposure for us, I think for derivatives is straightforward because we have the protocol, and it's going to be for us to explain. It's going to be standard for everybody. However, when it loans, and we have different opinions as far as customers are concerned. Some of them are still questioning why 2 years we have a forward-looking type of benchmark. Still, if it is not LIBOR, probably for us, the more challenging one will be a transition from JIBOR. Because most of our exposure is related to JIBOR instead of LIBOR. LIBOR accounts for less than maybe 10% of our total loan. JIBOR itself probably about half. So the most exposure is in JIBOR, but we are working closely with the regulators, this is BI and OJK, as to how this transition is going to take place. For JIBOR. Now, the last one is for the fallback language and adjustment. These are mainly the issues with regard to loans. For derivatives, it's very clear-cut because thanks to ISDA. But for loans will be more challenging. But maybe it's going to be bilateral, one by one. So it will take time. But we will start the process probably early next year to try to contact each other.
Sure. I mean, before we hear from Tony, who's on the panel, about the regulatory guidance you're getting, are you actively communicating with other market participants? Do you have a forum with other banks and with other financial institutions where you're openly discussing the changes and the communication? Or is it something that you're looking at internally?
Internally, we are doing it. Bilaterally, we are doing it through the processes in IFMC, which is Indonesia Foreign Exchange Market Committee. It is being regularly discussed. So there are the one we are internally, yes, bilaterally with our counterparties, yes, but also through the forum in FMC, we are also discussing it. And in the FMC, there are two committees discussing this, money market as well as derivatives committees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Pak Branko.
Thank you.
TP, we might just shift over to you to give us a perspective from Standard Chartered. Obviously, you know, if that perspective that Pak Branko shared in Indonesia is one that you also share, and then also maybe how that differs a little bit regionally and given the undertaking that Standard Chartered have.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan, and a big thank you to ASIFMA for holding this forum. I think it's a good time amidst everything that's going on. So we do share a lot of the concepts that Pak Branko has mentioned just now in terms of how we've looked at it from a Standard Chartered perspective. So obviously for Standard Chartered, we do operate across many jurisdictions, including having a fairly sizable presence in Indonesia itself. So our transition journey started in sometime in 2017, where the UK regulator started talking about the cessation of LIBOR. So following from that, a governance committee, so similar Pak Branko mentioned on BCA side, the governance committee was convened. This came under the ops side, the COO side actually, and because of the senior manager regime in the UK, so we've got a senior manager that's tagged with LIBOR transition responsibility. So we do have a central program that is set up globally to run the LIBOR transition program, and that will, we assist Standard Chartered Bank as a group across all our presence globally with the different teams, the different businesses, the different countries to they will all roll out this in a way the transition in a consistent manner. I think this is something that's, I think, interesting for us and as well as other banks, because we do use the same systems in multiple countries, so it sort of makes sense to have everything run at the central level, and then have any sort of local requirements being considered and adjusted. So at the central program level, I think it's important to have that governance. It's important to set up various work streams. I think Branko alluded to it for BCA. So we've got obviously the business streams where there's financial markets, whether it's lending, it's treasury. We've got the compliance streams, we've got the legal streams, we've got work streams to get contract remediation. So having that governance set up, I think it's important for financial institutions and also for corporates, so that you've got clarity on how you're organizing yourselves to manage transition. So the second bit, I think, which is I think important for corporates and banks, FIs will be look at the exposures. Like what Branko said, so for us, we've built an exposure dashboard to monitor our LIBOR exposures. We do have a fair bit, and monitor how they change over time. Look at the tenors, look at the exposure, look at the notional, look at the risk, look at it from different businesses. So I think having the exposure is important so that you can manage, what is your LIBOR exposure at any time. And like I said, this applies to both financial institutions and corporates. And this gives you then a good view of how you want to manage your transition, including the resources you should have towards managing the transition. Last but not least, I think a number of speakers have touched on this. There are actually I think local rates, right? In Indonesia, we've got JIBOR, we've got Indonesia being newly launched. So there are local benchmark reforms going on, and with OJK also obviously providing guidance. I think it is important for all firms to also be I think engaged and monitor what happens in Indonesia, because you will have guidance from the regulators and MBI. You will also have local LIBOR changes going on. So I think that's a few things that I think will be interesting. And related to this is obviously for both corporates and financial institutions to monitor, I think, the global developments. I think the key one, which I think Mushtaq talked about, was the IBA consultations. So IBA has consulted on the cessation of LIBOR, I think one tranche being in end of 2021, the other tranche, which is $5 tenors, being in middle of 23. So how does that, I think, consultation, which is, I think, right now in progress, and I think it's important for everyone to know that it's a consultation, it's not a decision yet, and how does that affect you and your transition plans, and also to note that post announcement of that consultation, a lot of the regulators, including the US and the UK, did say that what this does is to essentially provide that certainty, and that firms should actually not do any more new LIBOR transactions, especially US dollar LIBOR transactions, after the end of 21, unless there are very exceptional circumstances. Because I think there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of talk on whether this is an extension, whether things are delayed and things like this. But if you look at the regulatory statements, it's really about most of the LIBOR transactions, new LIBOR transactions, sort of ceasing by end of 21, and then after that you've got essentially 18 more months to have 18 more months to look at really how you remediate the legacy LIBOR. So I think the last point is really to keep updated, to talk to your bankers, talk to your regulators, talk to the industry associations to make sure that you're updated on what's going on. Back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, TP. I think there's some great points there. And I think it sort of goes to that original bank readiness survey around the difference between having a plan and having a team in place to look at and action that plan, right? Because the plan may need to change, right? I think that IBA consultation potentially doesn't impact it, but having people look at and assess the impact of the changing nature of the consultation and the legislation is a really important part of the transition. So thank you for that. So Tony, I mean, we've heard a lot from a couple of market participants. I'm sure everyone on the call is really looking forward to hearing from OJK around, some of the regulatory insight that you can provide. I think again, Pardoni mentioned that documenting governance and implementing the transition is a really important part, and I believe OJK is responsible for receiving those status reports, if you like. So maybe we can hear a little bit from you about your experience so far.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, and also thank to ASIFMA for inviting us as the panelists. And first of all, I think as the supervisors, as the banking supervisors, we are already communicating with the bank since I think 2019 about the LIBOR transitions, and then we also asked the bank to prepare, to set up the action plan for the transition strategy from the LIBOR into other alternative benchmark rate. And then we usually also identify internally in our banking supervisory department to identify which bank that has the LIBOR exposures. And then like the BA mentioned, there is 39 previously, but after today from the 39, there's only 30 banks that has LIBOR exposure. And from that, 3 banks have the LIBOR exposure, but it will be matured into before 2021. So also exclude from our discussion. So at least become 25 that have the LIBOR exposures until 2022, some of them. And then we ask the bank to at least, this bank, to at least conduct the self-assessment about the risk that they will face during the transition process. And then to set up the action plan, what will be their transition plan to address those risks. And then we also look at the action plan and then monitor closely about including their governance structure, the risk management program, and also the communication strategy from the bank to investor. And then we try to ensure that at least their customers are well informed about the transition process, and they have the new agreement with the customer, how to amend the contract and so on. I think that's all that I can say for now, Ray.
Okay. Thank you. I think just in the questions, there's 3 questions sitting there that I think maybe you can help give some insight on in terms of what the decommissioning plan, or if there is a decommission plan in place for JIBOR, for the existing overnight rate.
Okay, Ryan. I think that during our communication with Bank Indonesia, and we are closely coordinating with Bank Indonesia, the Indonesia is currently replaced the overnight JIBOR, but for at least for the near futures, we still use Indonesia and JIBOR as the benchmark rate. So there haven't any discussion about the compositioning about the JIBOR. So I mean, for the currently we will use both Indonesia and JIBOR. I mean, JIBOR is for 1 week and also 1 month until 12-month benchmark rate.
So there's no plan for decommissioning, and I guess if there is a plan, that will be actively communicated to the market, right, through the proper channels.
Yeah, but I think that, and I think currently BI already issued the blueprint for the money market blueprint for 2025, and in the blueprint BI already mentioned that it will use the Indonesia and also the JIBOR until at least 2025. So I mean, like, yeah, we will use it, and then we will also later on establish the overnight OIS as another benchmark probably later on, but it's still under development currently.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm just conscious of time because I know we've run a little bit over. And I know the session's supposed to end at 1:30 completely. So I might just speak quickly to Pak Branko and to TP one more time around the conduct element. So the communication. I mean, Pak Branko, you mentioned that you'll start doing that actively in January. I guess, are there any areas of concern there? Are you foreseeing any issues or any conflict in a particular segment or a particular asset class? Or overall, are you confident that the planning and preparation that you've done will lead to a fairly smooth communication route for your customers and counterparts?
Thank you, Ryan. Pak Tony mentioned we have plans, and we have informally also communicated with customers. As far as derivatives are concerned, it's very straightforward. It's thanks to that we already have a guide how to approach the transition, and it's going to be very easy to communicate with customers. The other one is the lending side, the loans, and loans related, similar to loans related to trade or others. Now, in many cases, this is going to take a longer communication because the level of knowledge is also different. There are many. There is going to be education, and also negotiation as to how the adjustment spread and the fallback language is going to be, and many of this is going to have communicate challenges in the communication more than derivatives. However, we are expecting smooth transition. It's going to be maybe initially, but because of the knowledge, but once they are explained, I think the customers are going to, or the corporates are going to understand and are going to go through with the transition as well.
Great, thank you. And TP, just really quickly, is that a similar perspective that you share at the moment in terms of, maybe in particular Indonesia or other jurisdictions?
Yep. So we've done, I think, a series of client awareness events. I think starting from earlier this year, we've done in-person events in a number of countries. Singapore, we've done something in Thailand, in the UAE, and we've done also, I think, since the pandemic and with all the restrictions, we've done webinars. So we are doing, like, on average 2 client webinars a month in the last 3 months. So essentially giving clients updates and clients information on what's the latest with the transition process. So I think that's one. So I think totally agree what Branko said. I think it's important that we maintain the comms, we engage the customers, we provide them information, so that the clients can use what we provide, think through, and then possibly ask more questions before they decide what they want to do. That's, I think, so that comms, in terms of giving, from a bank perspective, giving clients the information, I think that's an important aspect of it. Then the second bit is obviously I think materials. Clients would have received a number of emails from Standard Chartered regarding, for example, what our plans are with repricing, regarding the ISTA protocol, and the fact that we adhere to the ISTA protocol. I think that's I think key, right? Again, providing the information. Then the last bit is really enhancing our capabilities for clients to reach out to us. So we've got the central a central mailbox for LIBOR transition. We've enhanced our website with a dedicated LIBOR transition page where we put up our client event, client webinar recordings. We've put out information on the transition and what's the latest. So I think it's really having a I would say and a sort of holistic approach to client engagement. And then obviously, I think to one of the speakers' earlier points, having pretty specific and tailored comms for certain segment of clients, let's say within retail, in the retail world, in a number of countries where we've got LIBOR exposure for retail, to certain sort of corporate clients, to FI clients. So looking at the comms in slightly different ways. So all in, right, I think it's because of how important comms is and how important the transition is to make sure that clients understand. It is a key part of transition program for us, and I think for the other banks as well.
Great, thanks TP. And I mean, just finally, because we are getting a wrap up, but Tony, are there any last remarks that you'd like to make? I think given still 146 participants on the line, it'd be great to hear any closing remarks from OJK.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, OJK is closely monitoring the transition progress until now, and then we also asked the bank to submit the transition report at least in the semester 1 2021 to ensure that they're still in the right track, and then we will discuss with the bank after that. I mean, like after they give us the report, and then we will see the report, we will assess the report, and then we will discuss with the bank, and then we also try to look at what will be we can give as the support to the banks to ensure smooth transition in Indonesia. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Tony. And thank you to the panelists, Pak Branko and TP. And back to you, Philippe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. And indeed, thank you, Pak Branko. Thank you all, Tony. Thank you, TP, for your insight. Very much appreciated. Indeed, we still have 145 participants on the call, which speaks volumes on the interest that the participants in Indonesia have in this topic. So without further ado, I would like to move on to the next speaker, which is David Wakers, advisor at PwC Indonesia, who's going to provide us with an overview on accounting and taxation issues linked to the IBOR transition. David, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Philippe. So I'm very happy to be here talking with all of you today. I realize that after the end of the long session, accounting and tax might not feel like the sexiest of the agenda topics. But when a CEO calls and says, "Why do we have this surprise P&L?" it can really quickly become and feel like one of the most important areas. So let me try to very quickly touch on some key topics. It's a challenge because the details can be quite a bit more complex than some of the concepts. But hopefully it'll give you a sense for some of the things to think about. So as we go to the first slide, just an overall heat map around how this IBOR reform touches on different areas. If we go to the next slide. So the first is around what we've been talking about all morning, which is loans, financial instruments, derivatives, and yes, that clearly is the biggest or one of the biggest areas, but not to forget that there's a lot of other areas that can be impacted by IBOR reform. And even if you are not a financial institution, so for example, anything having to do with fair value methodology, discount rates, other things on the balance sheet, such as pension liabilities, provisions, reserving, impairments, asset impairment, goodwill impairment is a hot topic these days in the economic downturn. So understanding how that will be impacted as discount rates change as well is really important. There are also a number of new disclosure requirements, including how is the entity approaching IBOR reform? What are the financial instruments which are still to be impacted? If you have changes to your risk management strategy, that could change some of the disclosures that you have for that as well. And then, of course, tax. I think a lot of the operational impacts have been touched on previously by Sergey and others, but what I would say here is it's really important that those that are on the front end, dealing with customers, dealing with the contract modifications, the legal aspects, and so on, are engaging with the back end on the accounting and tax side to make sure that everyone understands what those implications would be and avoid any surprises in that respect. If we go to the next slide, let's start drilling down a little bit on loan modifications. So the amendments that have come through recently to try to address this in standards came in two phases. One dealt with the, if you will, pre-IBOR replacement period, which is primarily around things like hedge accounting, hedge effectiveness, and some of the requirements in those standards. And then phase two, which is, what happens when you've got actual changes to contracts, changes to contractual cash flows. And those amendments were not only about loans, but also dealt with leasing, which is a new thing in Indonesia this year, changes in lease accounting, insurance contracts, because you have insurers who are still using the pre-IFRS 9 standards and so on. But the concepts are similar, as you'll see. And if we, Flora, go to the next. The bad news here is that under the existing standards, any contract modification or modification to cash flows would likely result in a hit to the P&L, gain or loss, depending on what those modifications were. The good news is that there is relief that has been granted in these amendments that if the changes are a consequence of IBOR reform, then you can apply that relief to avoid the P&L impact. And for those that are more familiar, you would know that under the existing standards, if you have a change in cash flows, you would discount those back at the original contract effective interest rate. Under the relief, you can discount those back at the revised contracted effective interest rate. So you, in effect, have the same net present value and don't have a P&L impact. However, if you have changes that are outside of that, then they would still not be subject to that relief, and you would apply the existing standards. Now, there are two concepts here. Is it a direct consequence of interest rate benchmark reform, and is it economically equivalent? These are conceptual, principle-based concepts. There's not a lot of specifics in the amendments themselves, so there is judgment to be applied. But the way to think about this is that it's important that it's not only about IBOR reform, but is the change that's made more or less economically equivalent to what you had before. And if you think about some of the changes that would typically be directly related to IBOR reform, of course, you have changes in the rate, but it could also be the addition of a fixed spread to try to more or less get back to where you were before. It could be changes in the calculation methodology, changes to reset periods, reset dates, the insertion or removal of fallback clauses. So there are a number of other things that could also be considered a direct consequence. The things that would likely not be considered would be, of course, if you change the notional amount or the maturity date or the currency and so on. So this is not a sort of end-all solution where you can sort of throw every change in at this point and avoid a P&L impact. But for those things that are really very directly related to the IBOR reform, there's relief. If we go to the next slide. So this is just a visual representation of a two-step approach that if you do have changes that are both related to the reform and those that are not, how you would look at those separately. I won't belabor this. If you go to the next slide on case study, simple example, if you've got an initial contract, which is 3-month IBOR plus a spread, and you change that to be the risk-free rate plus a fixed spread, then you may not have exactly the same effective interest rate, but you can get relief and avoid any P&L impact. And if we go to the second case study, then what if you have the same thing, but you add in that you've got a 1-year interest-free period or windows there? Well, that's not directly related to IBOR reform, and that's something which would need to be taken out separately and looked at, and you very well would have a P&L impact associated with that. So it's important to understand all of the different changes that are occurring with any loan modifications. If we go to the next slide on hedge accounting, so again, a two-phase approach here. On my screen, I'm seeing a little bit of a delay on the slides, but I'm on the IASB relief hedge accounting slide. So phase one, dealing with those things which were about is the hedge still going to be effective? How do you look forward on this? Dealing with some of the uncertainty there. And then phase two, dealing with the specifics of change. And the takeaway here is that hedge accounting, despite these changes, can remain. Normally, you would have a change that would likely result in the hedge relationship being terminated. But you can continue that hedge accounting. But what's really important to remember is that any hedge ineffectiveness still goes to the P&L, right? So there's some relief about documentation, relief about overall treatment. It's sort of still in the boundaries of the hedge relationship, but any ineffectiveness is still plus or minus going to be going to the P&L. Next slide. Hedge accounting. This is not an accounting requirement, but it's just a reminder because many entities are trying to get a more precise match on the hedge relationship. So remember that it's not only about the rate, but you've got other things about timing, the method of calculation or payment, and any other modifications that might be to the hedge item itself. Next slide, I think we can skip because we've kind of covered it. And if we just end up with on the Sharia accounting considerations, this is a really important area for Indonesia because there's a lot of Sharia finance. It is a developing area, and the key point here is the Sharia principle of BER, which is around the need for upfront certainty on fundamental contract terms. And when we now throw into the mix backward-looking risk-free rates or fallback provisions to cost of funds or other changes, that could trigger some uncertainty into the situation that wasn't there before or wasn't technically there before. So there's a lot of discussion ongoing in this space, both in terms of what is the operational approach to contract change or change in terms, and also what is the accounting approach. So here I would simply say, watch this space, make sure you're engaging with your advisors in this area, as there could be some special consideration for the Sharia parts of your businesses. So I will stop there and hand back over to Philippe.
Thank you, David. And indeed, quite an interesting topic. Even though it's the end of the webinar, I still believe it's probably one of the most important parts. That's the one that hits the bottom line of of the P&L. So without further ado, I would like now to open the floor to Steve Dean, who's the President Director for FDIF in Indonesia, to provide us with some closing remarks. Over to you, Steve.
Philippe, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, so really interesting and really useful day. And first of all, on behalf of the organizers, ASIFMA and IFEMC, as well as Refinitiv and ICMA, we would like to thank our keynote speaker again, Pak Dani Hutabarat from Bank Indonesia, along with all of our distinguished speakers and panelists for gracing the event today as we look at the Indonesian perspective of the IBOR transition. Thank you also to all of the audience members for staying with us throughout the event. We appreciate that. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to. We actually have a slide that looks very much like Pak Doni's, one of Pak Doni's opening slides in terms of what are the instruments, what is the status, and the bottom line. I realize that we're short on time, so I'll be quick. The bottom line is that there are, as you've seen, there are a number of market data vendors that have all of the required information that banks, non-bank financial institutions, and corporates will need to look at as they affect the change to the new risk-free rate regime. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to just reference the comments that were made a while ago by Sergey from PwC in terms of the new compounding rates, and just highlight the fact that there are 3 different methods that are allowed as we evolve to the new risk-free rate term structure. These are all available within our system, and I am sure in other systems as well. The point that David made in terms of what's happening with Sharia lending and the calculation of those, where there is some speciality that needs to be looked at. Again, we think that the tools that we've developed in terms of look back as well as backward shift will be helpful with us, and we'll be happy to have a conversation with anyone who would find that to be useful. And then finally, if we can go to the to what is my last slide. One of the points that was made by Pak Doni is really the fact that derivatives, at least as a percentage of outstanding, derivatives are more impacted than most conventional loans are. And so there are calculators that are available on our system, and again, on other systems as well, to help the community through this transition. And let me just say that we think that even if the amounts in Indonesia are not huge, this transition is really important for the financial community, and we'll be happy to have conversations with anyone if we can be of assistance in terms of how to go through this transition, and to act as ASIFMA does in terms of being an educator and a change enabler for the community. So with that, I'm going to leave it, but I want to say thank you very much, in particular to ASIFMA, for organizing a most informative, timely, and topical seminar for the benefit of all of us. Thank you in particular to Mark, Philippe, Flora, and Millie for bringing this event together for the Indonesian community. And dengan demikian kami ucapkan sukses dan sehat selalu. Dan sekali lagi kami ucapkan terima kasih karena telah bergabung dengan kami di sini siang ini. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Steve. Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you all for attending this this call today. I hope you find it useful and insightful. I would like once again to thank our co-host, the Indonesia Foreign Market Exchange Committee, our lead sponsor, Refinitiv, our endorser, the ICMA, and of course all the speakers and firms who have contributed to make this conference and this webinar a success. Thank you very much again. Wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, Philip. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Philip.
Philippe. Thanks all.
Bye-bye all.